They didn't even wait for the cake to be cut. That's what hurt the most. The band had just finished playing its final note when I heard the first chair scrape against the floor, slow, deliberate, loud enough to slice through the thinning applause. I stood frozen beside a 3-tier cake shaped like champagne bottles and golden clocks, my name written in looping silver icing across the front. Congratulations, Elenore. 50 years old, 32 years of service, 1 retirement party. And suddenly, too many empty hands. The banners above me sagged where the tape had begun to peel. Happy retirement! In glittering blue letters, curling at the edges like they were already embarrassed to be there. I tightened my fingers around the stem of my champagne flute. It was sweating in my palm. So was I. Across the room, coworkers still smiled politely, clapping in uneven bursts, unsure whether to sit or stand or pretend nothing strange was happening. Their eyes keep drifting, not toward me, but toward the exit, toward my family. My daughter leaned close to her husband and whispered something sharp enough that his jaw tightened instantly. My oldest son wouldn't look at me at all. He stared at his phone, scrolling, nodding like he was checking sports scores instead of avoiding his own mother. My sister adjusted the flashy scarf around her neck, the one she only wore when she wanted to be noticed, and muttered under her breath, "This is embarrassing." I heard it. I heard everything. Minnesota winters teach you how to endure silence, but this wasn't silence. This was something worse. My daughter reached for her purse, my son cleared his throat, my sister stepped backward, and then they started leaving, one by one, not quietly, not with apologies, not with excuses. They walked past tables of untouched food, past balloon arches, past my coworkers holding gift bags and envelopes and awkward sympathy smiles, past me, in front of strangers, in front of people from my office, in front of cameras. Because yes, someone had been recording when the speeches started, and now that phone was still raised, hovering in the air like a witness nobody had invited. I kept smiling. Of course I did. 30 years in administration teaches you that. Smile when budgets get slashed, smile when supervisors take credit, smile when you swallow complaints, smile when your own family decides to abandon you in public. My lips held steady. My posture stayed upright inside my navy blue blazer, the good one, the tailored one I only wore to annual conferences. The cream blouse underneath it itched faintly at the collar, damp with sweat. Pearls rested against my collarbone, catching the overhead lights every time I turned my head too quickly. I didn't let my shoulders slump. I didn't chase them. I didn't ask them to stay. I didn't do anything except stand there with my trembling hands and pretend the room wasn't tilting. The flute was half empty. I don't remember drinking from it. I remember thinking, how do you survive the moment you realize the people you built your life around never planned to stay for the ending? I'm Elenore. I'm from Minnesota. I spent 3 decades behind state office desks and fluorescent lights and coffee machines that never worked properly. I raised 2 children, paid tuition bills I couldn't afford, skipped vacations, worked overtime, packed lunches, covered emergencies, lent money, gave rides, gave advice, gave silence when silence was easier. And tonight, of all nights, I thought I would finally hear someone say, "We're proud of you." The band packed up behind me. Someone popped another champagne cork too loudly. Laughter erupted near the buffet table. Not joyful laughter, that tight, nervous kind. The kind people make when they sense something ugly unfolding, but don't know whether to step in or step back. I shifted my weight in my heels. They were sensible, black, low. I'd bought them because I didn't trust myself not to trip tonight. Funny the things you worry about. Across the room, my daughter stood with her arms crossed over her designer coat, lips pressed into a thin line, checking her phone every 5 seconds like she had already mentally left the building. My son adjusted his wrinkled blazer, he always forgot to steam it, his jaw ticking in that nervous way he had since childhood whenever he didn't want to speak. My sister tilted her head, perfume drifting through the air and sharp floral waves, watching me with a half smirk she didn't bother hiding. Coworkers glanced between us, confused, concerned. Some of them had known me 20 years. They were holding gift cards and framed photos, and a ridiculous golden plaque that read, "The Queen of Organization." I swallowed. My throat burned. I heard someone whisper, "Is she okay?" Another voice, "Is her family leaving?" And then my daughter said it, not to me, to my sister, not quietly enough. "So what happens now?" My sister snorted. "Don't look at me." My son muttered, "She's not moving in with us." I felt that one land hard. I stared straight ahead, didn't blink, didn't turn, didn't react. Years of practice. My daughter sighed loudly. God, I knew this was coming. Coming, like I was a storm, like I was a burden, like retirement is a disease you catch after 50. A coworker tried to step closer. I waved her off without looking. If I opened my mouth right then, I wasn't sure what would come out. A sob, a scream, a confession. I wasn't ready for any of them. What none of them knew, what absolutely no one in that room understood, was that tonight was not the end of my story. It was the beginning. But at that moment, standing under sagging banners while my family debated my future like I wasn't 5 feet away, it felt like everything I had given my life to was walking out the door. And then I saw him, near the back of the room, a man in a charcoal suit I didn't recognize, silver hair at the temples, postured too straight to belong to the catering staff, watching. Not the cake, not the band. Me, like he already knew something. I didn't. I didn't know his name, I didn't know his role, I didn't know that decades earlier I had signed off on paperwork that saved his company from collapsing. I didn't know he'd asked to attend this party specifically. I didn't know he'd been waiting for the right moment to speak. All I knew was my family was leaving, my coworkers were staring, my hands were shaking, and something in the air had shifted. If you want to see what happens next, subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going, because this was only the first crack, and what came after changed everything. I didn't always notice when my own life started shrinking. It happens slowly, the way winters creep into Minnesota. One morning, the air is crisp, the trees still full, the world bright and promising, and then suddenly you wake up one day and realize the lake is frozen solid, and you can't remember the last time you stood still enough to admire the water. I used to think that was just what adulthood felt like. Work, family, bills, responsibility. You tell yourself it's temporary, that once the kids graduate, once the mortgage gets lighter, once the promotions come, once retirement is close enough to taste, you'll finally exhale. I told myself that for 32 years. I started at the state office when I was barely older than my daughter is now, fresh out of community college with a borrowed blazer and a resume that felt too thin for the weight of the life I was already carrying. My marriage was unraveling back then, quietly, painfully in the background, while I learned how to process permits, reconcile budgets, calm angry contractors on the phone, and stretch a paycheck across groceries, school supplies, heating bills, and birthday cakes I baked myself because bakery prices felt extravagant when braces were looming. I became good at being necessary. When someone called in sick, I stayed late. When deadlines crept closer, I stayed later. When supervisors needed someone reliable, someone who wouldn't complain, someone who wouldn't ask for public credit, they came to me. And I let them. Not because I loved fluorescent lighting or spreadsheets or the smell of burnt coffee drifting down government hallways, but because every extra hour meant another textbook paid for, another utility bill covered, another small cushion between my children and the word no. I missed school plays, rescheduled dentist appointments, ate dinners out of plastic containers in my car while parked outside hockey rinks and dance studios and library parking lots where my kids waited for rides I was already 10 minutes late to give. When other parents talked about vacations, I nodded. I politely nodded and kept quiet. When coworkers bragged about cruises, I smiled and said, maybe someday. Someday turned into years. Years turned into decades. Somewhere in the middle of all that, I stopped buying clothes for myself unless something wore thin enough to be embarrassing. I learned which grocery brands were cheapest. I memorized which bills could be paid 2 days late without penalties. I kept envelopes in my kitchen drawer labeled in neat handwriting, tuition, car repairs, Christmas, emergency, and moved money between them like a chess player trying to stay 10 moves ahead of disaster. My kids never knew that was the point. They had backpacks that fit, shoes that weren't too small, college acceptance letters pinned to the refrigerator with magnets shaped like tiny apples, and I stood in front of that fridge more than once with my hand pressed flat against the door, staring at those letters while the microwave beeped behind me, thinking, maybe, just maybe, I'd done something right. When my marriage finally collapsed for good, it did so without drama, just two tired people admitting they'd been walking parallel lives for too long. I didn't have time to fall apart. I had teenagers, I had tuition payments coming, I had overtime hours that suddenly mattered even more, so I kept going. I always kept going. Birthdays came and went. Promotions I didn't lobby for landed quietly on my desk because someone else had noticed my numbers, my accuracy, my habit of catching mistakes before they became disasters. I moved offices, got a slightly better chair, a door that closed, a title that sounded impressive enough to tell relatives at holidays. Administrator, I'd say, and they'd nod like they understood what that meant. What it meant was that I knew where every file lived. What it meant was that I could calm down 3 departments at once. What it meant was that when a project nearly collapsed, I was the one called into conference rooms to quietly fix what someone else had nearly broken. I didn't brag about it. I didn't talk about it at home either. At home, I was just mom. The one who reminded them to register for classes, the one who mailed checks, the one who picked up prescriptions, the one who answered late-night phone calls from dorm rooms when someone was homesick or overwhelmed or convinced they were failing at life after their first C-. I told them they were doing great. I told them they'd be okay. I told them I was proud. I don't remember them saying it back very often. Maybe they did. Maybe I just didn't notice because I was too busy checking the next thing off my list. Somewhere along the way, my sister started making little comments about how I worked too much, about how I should have aimed higher, about how I'd wasted my best years stuck behind a desk. I laughed them off. It was easier than explaining that desks paid for dorm rooms, that desks bought winter coats, that desks kept lights on. And then, one day, without any warning that my heart could recognize, retirement paperwork landed in my inbox. Forms, options, deadlines, buyouts, pension estimates. 32 years boiled down to columns of numbers. I printed them out at work and tucked them into my purse like something fragile, like if I looked at them too long, they might vanish. I didn't tell my kids right away, didn't tell my sister, didn't tell anyone outside the office. I needed time to understand what that chapter actually meant. I ran the numbers the way I always had, calculator clicking on my kitchen counter late at night while the house hummed quietly around me. I looked at savings I'd built without fanfare, investments I'd started when my youngest was still in high school because a coworker once convinced me to put $50 a month somewhere I couldn't easily touch. I looked at a small inheritance from my aunt that I'd never mentioned to anyone because it felt safer kept private. I looked at consulting offers tied to projects I'd helped stabilize years earlier, emails from people who remembered my name even when I'd assumed I was invisible. For the first time in decades, the math didn't terrify me. It surprised me. I realized I could choose, and that thought alone made my chest tighten, because choice had never been something I'd allowed myself much of. I signed the papers 2 weeks later, circled a date in my calendar, told my supervisor. She stared at me for a long moment, then stood up from behind her desk and hugged me so tightly I almost dropped my notebook. "We're throwing you something," she said, and I laughed and told her, "You really don't have to," and she waved me off. "Oh, yes we do." I assumed she meant a cake in the break room, maybe balloons, a card people would pass around awkwardly during lunch. I did not expect what happened next. I didn't expect to walk into a rented event hall near the river after work one evening and hear music spilling through open doors. I didn't expect lights strung across the ceiling, white tablecloths, a banner stretched crookedly across the far wall. "Happy retirement, Elenore." I froze just inside the entrance, my purse still slung over my shoulder, my coat half off one arm, while people I hadn't seen in years turned toward me all at once. Applause broke out. Someone whistled. A woman from procurement waved both hands in the air like I'd just walked onto a game show set. "Oh my God," I whispered to no one as I scanned the room in panic, already calculating how quickly I could slip back outside without anyone noticing. Too late. My supervisor clapped louder than anyone, grinning like she'd pulled off a magic trick. "We got you," she called, and I felt heat rush to my face and tried to protest, but she shook her head and told me to sit down because I didn't get to escape. There were balloons tied to chair backs, gift bags near the front table, a cake bigger than anything I would have bought for myself in 30 years, and I walked forward on legs that felt strangely disconnected from the rest of me, nodding at people, laughing when someone hugged me, answering congratulations I hadn't practiced receiving. And then I saw my family near the buffet. My daughter in her sleek coat, my son in a blazer that needed ironing, my sister's bright scarf cutting through the neutral colors of the room, and relief hit me so hard it almost made me dizzy, because they came. They actually came. And for a second, that was all that mattered. I didn't know yet that this was the night everything I believed about them and myself was about to change. I tried to pretend the knot in my stomach was excitement instead of dread, tried to convince myself that the strange tightness behind my ribs was just nerves from being the center of attention after so many years of blending quietly into the background. People kept coming up to me with warm smiles and paper plates balanced in their hands, telling me stories about projects we'd survived together, laughing about ancient printers that jammed every Tuesday, and budget meetings that had lasted so long we've forgotten what daylight looked like. I nodded and laughed in the right places, accepted hugs, accepted cards, accepted compliments that felt unreal, like they belonged to another version of me. Someone braver, someone louder, someone who expected applause instead of wondering when it would stop. My supervisor kept hovering nearby, clearly proud of herself for pulling this off, and every time she caught my eye, she lifted her glass in a tiny celebratory salute that made me smile, even when my shoulders felt locked in place. I could feel my family's presence behind me like a draft through a half-open door, something cold brushing the back of my neck every time I turned slightly. I saw them clustered together near the buffet, my daughter stiff and glossy, my son shifting his weight from one foot to the other, my sister leaning one elbow on the table like she owned the space. And that should not have bothered me, but it did, because they weren't moving. They weren't approaching, they weren't smiling at anyone except each other, and even then their smiles looked thin, forced, transactional. I caught my daughter's eye once and lifted my hand in a small wave. She hesitated before giving me a tight little nod that didn't reach her eyes, and the knot twisted tighter. My son glanced at the ceiling, suddenly fascinated by the string lights. My sister pretended to be deeply invested in the fruit platter. I told myself not to read into it, told myself they were just overwhelmed, told myself I was projecting my own anxiety onto perfectly normal behavior. But I've spent my entire career reading rooms, and the room was whispering at me now in ways I didn't like. Conversations near me began to slow. Coworkers who were laughing a second ago kept glancing over my shoulder and then back at me again, their smiles wobbling like they weren't sure whether to keep celebrating or brace for something. I noticed the phone before I noticed the person holding it, and that's how I knew it mattered. A small rectangle lifted too high for casual photos, hovering just above a woman's shoulder near the edge of the dance floor, its screen glowing faintly in the dimmed party lights, angled not toward the cake or the banner or the coworkers' clinking glasses, but toward me, toward my family, toward the awkward cluster that had been tightening like a knot all night. At first, I told myself I was imagining it because once your nerves are stretched thin, everything starts to look like a threat. Every glance feels loaded, every laugh sounds sharper than it should. But then the phone tilted slightly, adjusted focus, steadied, and my stomach dropped because that wasn't accidental. That was someone recording. Maybe they thought it was funny, maybe they thought it was dramatic, maybe they just smelled tension the way some people always do and leaned toward it like heat from a fire. I tried to move without making it obvious, drifting a few steps to the side, pretending to greet someone while keeping the glowing screen in my peripheral vision, and the longer it stayed up, the more my pulse hammered in my ears. I have spent my life avoiding scenes, smoothing rough edges, keeping disagreements behind closed doors, and now here I was, under string lights and balloons, with a stranger possibly live streaming my family's quiet dissection of my future. I forced myself to keep smiling, even as my jaw ached from holding it in place, and my hands trembled so badly I nearly sloshed champagne onto the floor. Someone asked if I wanted another drink, and I shook my head too quickly, almost spilling what was left in my glass, and that was when I heard my sister again, clear as day, drifting through the hum of music and chatter, because she had never mastered the art of lowering her voice when she thought she was right. "I'm just saying, this is exactly what I warned you about," she said. My daughter sighed audibly, and my son muttered something under his breath. "Warned us about what?" my daughter asked. "About her not planning properly, about this turning into a mess," my sister replied, and my chest clenched so hard it felt like something inside me had seized. My daughter said she didn't want to talk about it here, and my sister laughed softly, the sound sharp enough to cut. "Well, where else are we supposed to talk about it? We're already here, aren't we?" I took a slow step closer, pretending to examine the dessert table, while every nerve in my body screamed at me to run instead. My son said they could discuss it later, and my sister snapped that later always becomes never, and someone had to be realistic. My daughter lowered her voice, but not enough. She said she wasn't trying to be cruel, she just didn't want surprises, and that word, surprises, echoed in my head like a warning bell, because I had a few of those tucked neatly away, and none of them matched the story they were building about me. My sister scoffed and said surprises cost money, and that was the problem, and I felt heat rush to my face so fast I was sure my cheeks were glowing. My son shifted uncomfortably and said maybe Mom had more saved than they thought, and I almost smiled at that tiny scrap of defense until my sister shot it down with a dismissive wave of her hand and said, "Don't be naive, you saw her house. She drives the same car she's had for years. She clips coupons, for heaven's sake." And I bit the inside of my cheek so hard it stung, because yes, I drove the same car, and yes, I clipped coupons, and no, those things had nothing to do with the desperation, and everything to do with habit and discipline, and a lifetime of choosing practicality over flash. My daughter hesitated, then said quietly that she just didn't want to be responsible for supporting another adult, and that sentence hit harder than anything else that night, because it stripped away every soft edge and left the raw truth underneath. I wasn't a mother in that moment. I was a potential liability. My throat tightened until it felt hard to swallow, and I glanced again toward the glowing phone, only to see it shift closer, whoever was holding it angling for a better view, like they could sense the story sharpening. I turned slightly, pretending to reach for a napkin while sliding closer to the column near the buffet so I could hear every word, whether I wanted to or not, because ignorance felt worse now than pain. My sister said she'd seen this coming for years, that I was too comfortable, too passive, too willing to settle, and that eventually it would catch up to me. My daughter whispered that people change after retirement, and my son added something about medical bills and long winters and heating costs, and I felt dizzy because they were constructing an entire future for me out of fears and assumptions, while I stood 10 feet away clutching a paper napkin like it was the only thing keeping me upright. Someone brushed past me and apologized, and I nodded automatically, barely registering them because my focus had tunneled in on my family's voices and the sickening realization that none of this was new to them. They'd been thinking about this for a while. They'd been worrying and planning and judging long before tonight ever arrived. My sister said she didn't mean to sound harsh, but they needed to protect themselves, and my daughter agreed quietly, and my son didn't argue, and that silence from him felt like a door slamming shut. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second longer than necessary and inhaled slowly through my nose, counting the way I do when I'm trying not to cry in public. 1, 2, 3, 4. Out. 1, 2, 3, 4. And when I opened them again, the phone was still up, still recording, still hungry. I felt something inside me shift then. Not break, not explode, but harden, like water finally freezing after a long, cold stretch. I straightened my shoulders, lifted my chin, and let my face settle into something calm and unreadable, because if this was going to turn into a spectacle, I was not going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble first. But my heart was racing now, my pulse loud in my ears, and I knew with a sudden cold certainty that I had heard enough to last me the rest of my life, and whatever came next was not going to be small. I don't remember deciding to move. I just remember the feeling in my chest changing from something fragile and aching into something heavier and steadier, like a weight settling into place where fear had been rattling around moments before. My fingers loosened from the napkin I'd nearly shredded without realizing it, and I set my empty glass down on the nearest table because I didn't trust my hands not to shake anymore. The music blurred into the background, the chatter around me faded until all I could hear was the rush of blood in my ears and the faint echo of my sister's voice still still bouncing around inside my head. Protect yourselves, that's what she had said. And suddenly, something inside me went very quiet, the way a lake goes smooth right before it freezes solid. I smoothed my blazer once down the front out of pure habit, straightened the pearl necklace at my throat, lifted my shoulders, and took one step forward, and then another. My heels sounded too loud against the floor, but nobody stopped me because nobody was paying attention yet. Not really. They were still laughing, still talking, still recording, still whispering about me like I was furniture. I reached the front of the room without quite understanding how I'd crossed that much space, and when I turned around, every face blurred together for a second. Coworkers, family, strangers, my children, my sister, the woman with the phone, all swimming in a soft, unfocused haze until I blinked and forced my eyes to lock on something solid, the edge of the cake table, the microphone stand beside it, the banner sagging overhead. My supervisor noticed first, her smile faltering just slightly as she tilted her head and questioned, and I held up one finger, not in a demanding way, just a gentle, please wait kind of way, and that was enough for her to step back. The band quieted one instrument at a time, the way people do when they sense something is shifting, and the sudden drop in noise felt like pressure in my ears. I could feel my heart hammering, but my hands were steady now, and that scared me more than if they had been shaking. I reached for the microphone, and it was cool and heavier than I expected, and when I lifted it, a murmur rippled through the room, people straightening in their chairs, lowering forks, nudging each other with raised eyebrows, because this wasn't on the schedule. My daughter froze mid-sentence near the buffet, my son's eyes snapped up, my sister's smile flickered. I drew in a slow breath, the kind I use before answering difficult questions in meetings, and another because my voice didn't feel ready yet. And when I finally spoke, it came out softer than I thought it would, almost gentle. "Thank you," I said, and my own name echoed faintly in my head like I wasn't quite sure who I was thanking anymore. "Thank you all for coming tonight." I glanced around at the coworkers who'd spent decades in conference rooms with me, the people who'd organized this, the ones holding gift bags and cameras and kind eyes, and my chest tightened a little bit now too, not with hurt, but with something closer to gratitude. "I really didn't expect any of this," I admitted, and a few people chuckled because that part at least was obviously true. I lowered the microphone for a second, cleared my throat, and lifted it again. "I've spent most of my career trying not to be noticed," I said, and there was a ripple of soft laughter at that too, because they knew it too. The woman who fixed problems quietly, the one who sent reminder emails nobody remembered the source of, the one who stayed late and locked up behind everyone else. But I meant it in a deeper way than they realized. I meant in my life, in my family, in the way I'd learned to make myself smaller so everyone else could be comfortable. My gaze drifted for a heartbeat toward my children, toward my sister, and then back to the room at large because I wasn't ready for that part yet, not out loud. "I want you to know how much this means to me," I continued, my voice steady, even though my chest still felt tight. "Truly. I never imagined walking into something like this. I thought I'd maybe get a sheet cake in the break room and a card with too many signatures to read. More laughter, gentle, kind laughter, and it loosened something in me just enough to keep going. But this is overwhelming, in the best way," I added, and I saw my supervisor wipe at one eye, and that nearly undid me, so I focused on the cake instead, the ridiculous, beautiful cake, and kept talking. "I've spent 32 years in public service," I said slowly. 32 years of budgets and forms and emergency meetings. I let the applause fade instead of rushing to fill the silence, because I'd learned a long time ago that quiet makes people lean forward. It makes them uncomfortable. It makes them pay attention. And right now, I wanted every single person in that room to be listening, whether they'd planned to or not. I took one slow breath and rested both hands around the microphone like it was an anchor. "I know a lot of people hear the word retirement and think it means the end of usefulness," I said gently. "Like you reach a certain age and suddenly you're supposed to shrink your life down to fit into something smaller, simpler, quieter." A few heads nodded automatically because that thought is stitched into us whether we admit it or not. I felt my sister's gaze on me like heat, but I didn't look at her yet. "I've spent most of my adult life planning for this moment," I went on, saving a little when I could, putting something aside even when it meant saying no to things I wanted because I had people depending on me. I smiled slightly at that because understatement has always been my specialty. And I want to be very clear about something tonight. My voice dropped just enough that the room stilled. I am not afraid of what comes next. I paused again, letting that settle before continuing. I am not moving in with anyone. A ripple moved through the crowd, not loud, not dramatic, but curious. I am not downsizing because I have to, and I am not scrambling to figure out how to make ends meet. My daughter's head snapped up so fast I saw it out of the corner of my eye. My son went still. My sister's smile froze halfway across her face. I swallowed and kept going because stopping now would be worse. A few weeks ago, I sold my house, I said calmly, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to, because I chose something different for myself for the first time in a very long time. The room felt like it was holding its breath. I accepted a consulting position tied to the retirement package for my department and a few long-term projects I helped stabilize years ago, I added. And that part wasn't bragging, it was just fact, something solid and earned. I invested early and consistently, even when it meant clipping coupons and driving the same car for too long and pretending I didn't want nicer things. And those choices added up. My voice didn't shake when I said that, and I was quietly proud of myself for it. I will be more than comfortable, I finished simply. I don't say that often, but tonight I think it's important. Because there are a lot of assumptions people make about women my age, about mothers, about public servants, about what happens when we stop working full-time, and most of them are wrong. The silence was thick now, not awkward, not bored, but stunned. I could feel it pressing in from every side, and I finally turned my head toward my family because it was time. My daughter stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time. My son's mouth hung open just slightly. My sister's eyes narrowed, and for a fleeting second, something like regret flickered across all three faces before they masked it with something else, something guarded. I gave them a small nod, not triumphant, not cruel, just factual, and turned back to the room. I didn't share that because I wanted applause, I said quietly. I shared it because I spent too many years letting people assume things about me without correcting them, and I'm done doing that. A few people clapped uncertainly at first, and then more joined in until the sound swelled and rolled across the room in a way that made my chest tighten for a very different reason than earlier. And that was when a man near the back of the room stepped forward. Tall, silver hair at his temples, charcoal suit catching the light, the same man I'd noticed watching earlier. He didn't look confused or shocked like everyone else. He looked amused in a gentle, knowing way, like a puzzle piece had just clicked into place. He raised one hand slightly, as if asking permission to interrupt, and my supervisor glanced at me questioningly, and I nodded because curiosity had already curled inside my stomach. "Excuse me," he said in a voice that carried easily, without effort. "I hope you don't mind, but I think I should introduce myself." A murmur rippled through the crowd as he moved closer, and suddenly a few people gasped quietly because they recognized him before I did, and that was when I finally caught his name drifting through whispers around me, a last name tied to headlines and business pages and corporate rescues. He stopped a few feet away from me, smiling in a way that was warm rather than arrogant, and held out his hand. "Elenore," he said calmly, "I doubt you remember me, but you once saved my company without ever knowing it." My heart stuttered. I stared at his hand for a second too long before taking it, and his grip was firm and steady. "I'm sorry? What?" I asked, and he chuckled softly. 23 years ago, my firm was hemorrhaging money because of a procurement nightmare buried inside a state contract nobody wanted to touch. Everyone told me it would take months to fix if it could be fixed at all. And then one afternoon, I got a call from an administrator who had already rebuilt the entire framework and flagged 3 illegal bids before we'd even finished explaining the problem. I felt heat creep up my neck because I knew exactly what he was talking about. A late night, a pot of burnt coffee, a file box taller than my desk, and a decision that felt routine at the time. "That was you," he said simply. "You saved us millions, and you never once tried to turn it into publicity. I've never forgotten that name." The room exploded into whispers, and my supervisor stared at me like she was reconsidering my entire resume in real time. I blinked, stunned, and managed to say I was just doing my job, and he smiled wider. "People say that when they change the course of things," he replied, and then he turned slightly toward the crowd. "For what it's worth," he added agilely, "if you're consulting in retirement, I suspect you're about to be very busy, because people like me don't forget competence when we see it." Laughter rippled through the room this time, lighter, amazed, and something inside me loosened that I hadn't realized had still been clenched. I stood there with a microphone in my hand, my family staring, my coworkers buzzing. I felt something close to exhilaration, because the story they'd been telling about me behind my back had just been replaced with one I hadn't even known I was allowed to say out loud. The room didn't explode into shouting like movies like to pretend these moments do. It fractured into something quieter and far more revealing, the kind of sound people make when the ground shifts under their feet and they don't know where to put them anymore. Whispers layered over one another, chairs scraping back again, phones lifting higher this time with a different kind of hunger, because now this wasn't just awkward, it was astonishing. My coworkers leaned toward one another, wide-eyed, my supervisor's mouth hung open just a little, and somewhere behind me someone muttered, "Holy," and stopped themselves. I could feel the weight of my family's stare long before I turned back toward them, because when you've spent decades reading the temperature of a room, you can feel shock the way you feel a draft through a closed door. My daughter was the first to recover. Her lips parted like she was about to say my name, then closed again, then opened again, and nothing came out. My son stared at the floor like it might offer instructions. My sister forced a laugh that sounded thin and brittle and far too loud for the moment. "Well, that's wonderful," she said, clapping once too quickly. "Look at that, you've done quite well for yourself." Pride puffed up in her tone that made my stomach twist because I recognized it for what it was, panic wearing perfume. I watched my sister glance between my face and the silver-haired man like she was recalculating an entire spreadsheet in her head, and my son rubbed the back of his neck the way he does when he's overwhelmed and suddenly too aware of everyone watching. My sister leaned toward them, whispering urgently now, no longer careless with her volume, and I caught fragments drifting through the air about misunderstandings and assumptions and how nobody meant anything the wrong way. My daughter nodded too fast, and my son finally looked up at me with something flickering behind his eyes that hadn't been there earlier, uncertainty threaded with something dangerously close to shame. I lowered the microphone slowly and handed it back to my supervisor because my hands were starting to shake again, not with fear this time, but with adrenaline and exhaustion, and the strange, hollow feeling that follows a confrontation you didn't plan, but desperately needed. People began approaching me in small clusters, offering congratulations again, this time with new expressions, like they'd just discovered a hidden chapter in a book they thought they already knew. The silver-haired man shook my hand once more and told me he hoped I'd take his assistant's call, and I nodded, because right then my brain was moving too slowly to do anything else. And through it all, my family hovered just out of reach, like they couldn't quite decide whether to step closer or pretend none of this had happened. My sister finally made a decision and swept forward with her brightest smile, arms opening wide as if she'd been planning to hug me all night. "Elenore, darling," she said. "You should have told us. We were worried for nothing." I stepped back before she could touch me, and the simple act felt louder than any speech I'd given. Her arms dropped awkwardly, and for a second, the mask slipped. "I wasn't worried," I said quietly. "Not anymore." My daughter flinched, like the words had landed physically, and my son swallowed hard. My sister tried to recover immediately, waving a hand dismissively. "Well, you know how families are. We fret, we speculate, it's what we do." I tilted my head just slightly, studying her the way I'd studied documents for decades, looking for what didn't line up. "You were discussing where I'd live," I said, and the room around us seemed to dim as nearby conversations faltered. My daughter's face flushed deep red, my son closed his eyes for a brief second, my sister's mouth opened, then shut. I continued, just as calmly, "You were talking about whether I would be a burden." And now my daughter stepped forward. "Mom!" But I lifted one hand. Not sharply, not angrily, just enough to stop her, and she froze mid-word. "I'm not saying this to embarrass you," I said. and I meant it. I'm saying it because for years I let people make decisions about me without asking what I wanted, and tonight I realized I don't have to do that anymore. My sister sputtered something about stress and misunderstandings, and my son whispered that they hadn't meant it that way, and my daughter's eyes shone with something that might have been regret or might have been calculation, and I honestly wasn't sure which scared me more. I nodded once, because I had heard enough explanations for one evening. "I don't need apologies right now," I said, and the truth of it surprised even me. I need space. My supervisor appeared at my side then, placing a hand lightly on my back, not protectively, but supportively, and that small gesture felt like an anchor. The band had started playing again softly in the background, trying to stitch the party back together, but the energy had shifted irrevocably. My sister muttered something under her breath and turned away. My daughter hovered uncertainly, and my son looked like he wanted to say something else, but couldn't find a version that wouldn't make things worse. I looked at all three of them and felt something unfamiliar settle into my chest. Not anger, not triumph, just clarity. "I love you," I said, because that part was still true, even if it hurt. But I am not available to be spoken about like I'm not in the room anymore. Silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable and necessary. Then I picked up my coat from the back of a chair and slipped it on slowly, deliberately, giving myself time to breathe, to steady, to make sure my voice wouldn't waver when I spoke again. "I'm going to head out with a few friends from work," I added, and that word friends felt significant in a way I hadn't expected. My daughter blinked, my sister stiffened, my son nodded faintly, like he understood, even if he didn't like it. I hugged my supervisor, hugged two women I'd shared countless late nights with, thanked them again for the party, and meant it with every tired, grateful bone in my body. I didn't look back at my family when I walked toward the door, because I didn't need to. The cool night air outside hit my face like a blessing, the river smell sharp and clean and real, and for the first time all evening, I let myself breathe without holding anything in. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket, but I ignored it, stepped down the front stairs with steady legs, and realized something that felt like the quietest kind of victory had just taken place. Not loud, not dramatic, not viral, just solid and internal and irreversible. I wasn't leaving in shame, I wasn't leaving in tears, I wasn't wondering what I'd done wrong. I was leaving exactly the way I'd entered my career decades ago, steady, prepared, and finally fully aware of my own worth. And whatever came next with my family would happen on my terms, or not at all. The night air felt colder than I expected, but cleaner too, the kind that fills your lungs all the way down instead of stopping somewhere behind your ribs. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer than necessary, letting the sounds from inside the hall blur into a distant hum while traffic whispered past and the river breathed somewhere beyond the buildings. My coworkers gathered a few steps away, giving me space, in the gentle, unspoken way people do when they know something important has just happened and don't want to crowd it. I slipped my hands into my coat pockets and felt my phone buzzing again and again against my palm, but I didn't pull it out yet because I wasn't ready to read whatever waited on that screen. Not tonight. Tonight, I wanted silence, the good kind, the kind that doesn't ache. One of the women from procurement asked if I was all right, and I surprised myself by answering honestly, "Yes, I am." And the words felt strange and perfect at the same time. We laughed softly about grabbing coffee soon, about keeping in touch, about how retirement apparently didn't mean disappearing, and then they drifted off toward their cars, leaving me alone under the glow of a street lamp that hummed faintly over my head. I stared at the light reflecting off the hood of my old sedan and smiled at the thought that I would probably keep driving it for years, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I finally checked my phone then, and the screen was crowded with notifications, missed calls, texts from my daughter, from my son, from my sister, from unknown numbers I didn't recognize yet, and I didn't open any of them. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and leaned against the car for a moment, closing my eyes and letting the events of the night replay, not as sharp as before, not cutting, but instructive, like a lesson I'd been overdue to learn. I thought about my family's faces when I spoke. I heard my own voice steady and calm in ways I hadn't known it could be, and I felt something shift deep inside me, a quiet click, like a lock turning. I thought about all the years I had equated love with endurance, and silence with strength, and sacrifice with virtue, and how none of those things are wrong, but how dangerous they become when they're the only tools you ever use. I thought about the envelopes in my kitchen drawer, the late nights with calculators, the investments I'd started without telling anyone, the consulting offers I'd nearly dismissed because part of me still believed wanting more was somehow selfish. I realized how small I'd trained myself to be, and how easily people had accepted that version of me because it was convenient for them. And instead of feeling angry about it, I felt oddly light, as if setting that truth down had freed up space in my chest I hadn't known was cramped. I opened my car door and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, resting my forehead briefly on the cool leather and laughing under my breath at how surreal the whole evening had been. A party, a reckoning, a rebirth disguised as cake and balloons. I thought about the silver-haired executive and the way he said my name like it mattered, and my supervisor's hand, warm and steady at my back, and the realization that I had built a life of competence and quiet power, even if I hadn't celebrated it properly before. I thought about my children, too, and that ache didn't disappear, but it softened into something manageable, something patient, because growth doesn't always look like reconciliation right away. Sometimes it looks like distance and boundaries, and letting people sit with the consequences of what they assumed. I started the engine finally, and the radio flickered to life before I turned it off again, preferring the hush of the car and my own breathing. I drove slowly toward home, past familiar streets glowing with porch lights and late-night windows, and snow piled at the edges of sidewalks, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was driving toward obligation, or rescue, or the next thing that needed fixing. I was driving towards something open and undefined, and entirely mine. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat there a little longer, watching my breath fog the windshield and whispering to myself that it was okay not to have all the answers yet, because I had something better now: clarity. I stepped out into the cold, locked my car, and paused on my front walk, listening to the quiet of my own neighborhood and feeling a strange, fierce tenderness toward the woman I'd been for decades, the one who had kept going no matter what. And an even fiercer pride in the woman I was becoming, the one who no longer needed to disappear in order to be loved. And as I went inside, I knew this new chapter of my life wasn't about slowing down. It was about choosing myself with the same devotion I spent a lifetime giving to everyone else. And if this story touched you, if you've ever felt overlooked or underestimated, or quietly carried more than anyone realized, then stay with me, because there is so much more to come. Subscribe for the next story and comment where you're watching from, because I would truly love to say hello and see how far the story travels. Thank you for staying with us.